Hello, it is December 2024, and I would like to discuss protecting your organization from supply chain attacks. In 2024, supply chain cyber attacks have experienced a significant rise, with reports including near constant occurrences of attacks targeting software supply chains, often hitting our critical sectors of healthcare, technology, manufacturing, and most frequently targets our IT business providers and companies that provide technology products such as SolarWinds. We've seen others prominently discussed over the years. So, some key points to think about here when we're understanding supply chain attacks: the frequency. Experts report almost one software supply chain attack happens every 2 days globally, with the US being one of the major targets. Besides IT providers, industries like the aerospace and defense, manufacturing, healthcare are often targeted in supply chain attacks. These vulnerabilities are increasing um, as attackers are utilizing software updates and third-party components to gain access to the wider networks. Potential consequences of these attacks lead us to data breaches, operational disruptions, and financial losses. So, why do we need to focus on the supply chain attack? Most attackers are going to go after your third and fourth party vendors and exploit their vulnerabilities instead of coming after the Fortune 100 directly. This could be seen through the Target breach when they went after the HVAC. This could be, as we mentioned just a second ago, the SolarWinds where they updated the Orion agent and got it packaged and pushed. This could also be just finding ways to mimic a Windows update service to allow them to get into your environment. The impact here can lead to significant downtime. Let's say you're a manufacturing company, you work 24/7, 365 days. If I'm able to compromise your production line and stop the widgets, I'm going to also halt your services. I'm going to cause revenue to go down because the manufacturing line is down. And I'm also going to cause a shortage of your products and services depending on who you're providing. We've already mentioned SolarWinds, we've mentioned Target, but Starbucks and Amazon themselves have also been impacted by these breaches over the years. So, how do we mitigate a supply chain attack? It starts with your vendor vetting. Thoroughly evaluate your security practices of your third party vendors. Conduct background checks, references. Ensure that their practices align with your organizational standards. Implement timely software updates and patching. Make sure that you're auditing your security controls, your policies, your procedures to help identify and mitigate potential vulnerabilities. Access control. Implement strong identity and access management policies. Control how data sharing works. Can it be one way or two ways? Do you have the ability to put in policy that once the data has been consumed, it needs to be destroyed and then a certificate of destruction? And then do continuous monitoring. Use your threat intelligence, monitor for emerging threats and vulnerabilities in all of your supply chain attacks. Work with your third party risk management team to identify vendors that you rely on for your daily operations. Make sure that you have a plan in place if they are compromised or you find that their product or services or agents have been reported to be involved in a supply chain attack where they have been compromised. Develop an IRP, an incident response plan. Make sure you have a plan to quickly respond to and recover from your supply chain attack. This means doing tabletops, emulating what it would be like for a supply chain attack to hit one of your key providers who is providing services to you. This could be the HVAC service who's managing all of your data centers. This could be a third party service who's providing food. So their point of sale systems being compromised where they're managed outside of your company cafeteria. Or if you're a retail person, this could be your point of sale systems that's actually in your stores, either self checkout or the POS systems that your cashiers are using. So let's think about how we secure communication and encryption. We got to make sure that we teach our users and our organizations how to properly share data using encrypted email, using end-to-end encryption, making sure that when the email is sent that it's not decrypted until it hits the user's inbox. Rely on technology such as virtual private networks to make sure that once you connect, as soon as you boot up your laptop or your phone or your tablet, you immediately connect to a VPN to establish a secure tunnel between you and the sites that you're working with so that your traffic cannot be sniffed without it being decrypted and processed. Use secure messaging platforms to ensure sensitive information is exchanged, not in clear text. It's important to make sure that you encrypt your data both in transit and at rest. So data encryption. This is important because without encryption, plain text, anyone who sniffs your traffic across the routers and switchers of the internet can read your data if it's not encrypted. This means when you send that email from your Outlook or Gmail or another email platform to the vendor, if it's not encrypted, any networking equipment between you and that vendor has the ability to read that data. So make sure that you're putting data encryption both at rest and in transit. So when I say at rest, that makes sure that you have full disk encryption on your endpoints. Make sure that any backup solution that you're using is using encryption as well to encrypt the files before they're written to disk. And then make sure that the vendor is able to give attestation, my apologies, to how they handle data destruction. I mentioned in the previous slide, access control. Make sure that any data that's in your environment has proper data classification, has data permissions applied. Make sure that you're using discretionary access controls or mandatory access controls and not just putting everyone on a folder. For example, most organizations today, when you join, have access to thousands of files just on day one because of the permissions that's granted to certain file shares, folder structures that you were granted when you were onboarded as part of your birthrights given to you as an organization. So that leads into employee education and training. We have to rely on training our employees. We have to use the human-centric piece of our organization with part of the people, process, and technology. We have to educate our employees on what a supply chain attack looks like. We have to educate them on the common attack methods to help them be able to identify and then stop, assess, and then report to avoid a potential threat to our organization. Phishing is still one of the primary attack vectors people still get in. They send you a fake invoice, a fake ACH for money transfer, or they send you a file that's weaponized with a Trojanized macro trying to get you to run that into your environment that you can compromise. So, for example, one of your software developers who's actually building out the software for your next latest agent release downloads a piece of malware from an email he or she receives, and now it compromises the box. If the adversary can get that process added to the build process and it's not called during your CI/CD process, your continuous integration, continuous deployment, or delivery with SAST, so your static or your dynamic scanning processes, these can get into your supply chain, your release schedule. Talk about that in future conversations, but you need to make sure that as part of your application security, you are scanning your code at build and at run and making sure that you're properly testing with static and dynamic testing throughout your life cycle of your code. Data security practices. Make sure that your employees understand how to handle sensitive information. Make sure they're not downloading financial data from their ERPs. They're not downloading it from Salesforce and keeping it locally on their box. Make sure that your HR teams are not bringing personnel files down locally and interacting with them and keeping them in a place that anyone can access, such as saving them to their desktops. Make sure your system administrators are not putting root passwords in a plain text file called passwords on their desktop. All of these things are part of your education and training. You need to make sure your employees understand how to properly handle the data that they're interacting with. All the examples you just gave are appropriate usage for those three departments to interact with data, but do they know how to handle that data successfully? HR doesn't need my personal social security number sitting at rest on their endpoint. The finance team doesn't need all of my credit card information or ACH data sitting locally on their endpoint to process my files or to sell me additional licenses. The developer or the sysadmin doesn't need to keep root passwords in plain text on their endpoints. They should be encrypting them, putting them into their code, saving them into a password manager. Additionally, ensure that you're using multi-factor. So even if you do get that password or that piece of information, they're still required to use a second form of authentication to overall strengthen your security posture. Because we all know with data breaches today, usernames and passwords are leaked almost daily. This leads into the IRP I mentioned to earlier. Does your organization have a proper incident response plan? Do they know what to do if an incident is detected? Have they established a process for that? Do they know how to monitor for third-party breaches? Can they contain? Do they know properly how to isolate a system? Do they have the authority to isolate a system? Let's give an example again. Can I isolate a VIP, a very important person, such as a VP, an executive, a board member who happens to get compromised? Do you have that authority? Do you have the proper chain of command in the approval process to isolate the CEO's endpoint or to take the CFO offline or a developer who's about to push a production code? Do you have the authority to properly isolate those endpoints? During your investigation, make sure that you determine your root cause of the attack. Identify any compromised system and the data, and make sure that you use chain of custody when gathering your evidence. Recovery efforts are imperative. It's important to restore infected systems and data. This is likely from a reliable backup solution. Again, make sure that you do validated recovery, not just validated backup. You do not want to be sitting in the middle of an incident and go to restore data and find out that it's corrupt, or that the job that's been running nightly or daily or hourly hasn't been writing data to your endpoint. Test and have a validated recovery. Additionally, use this as an opportunity. No incident should be left as it's an opportunity to improve your security posture. We all have lessons learned. We all learn from what each incident happens each and every day. It starts at home. The first time we trip and fall, we know to tie our shoes. The first time we touch the stove after cooking, we know not to touch hot objects. The same goes with a security incident. Your end users, your developers, and your leaders have lessons learned from every incident. So analyze them, identify them, and update your policies and your procedures to reflect that to help harden your environment against potential future supply chain or other cyber attacks. This goes into the continuous monitoring piece and improvement. Perform regular security assessments. Conduct these assessments quarterly, semi-annually, annually across your environment. I mentioned earlier, run tabletop exercises. Make sure that you can execute your DR/BCP plans as part of your IRP plan. Do you understand what vendors and suppliers are dealing with? Have you looked at, if they're a publicly traded company, their recent K8s to see how they got compromised and who was responsible? Review their audits, review their findings, and if they're cloud-based, do your due diligence in your third-party risk management to look at their SOC 2 Type 2, their ISO, and their pen test reports. There's a lot of information you can learn from what vendors are doing and what your adjacent industry partners are doing. So if you're in the financial institution, look at what other financial industry organizations are dealing with. What attacks have they been part of? Have they been compromised? Have they stopped? You continue that process by sharing knowledge. Get into your information sharing groups. Do networking. We all in this together. Security is not competing against security. We all want every organization that we do business with, partner with, and even compete with to be secure and readily available. Part of our CIA tribe we talked about in other calls and many of our meetings today. We want availability to be there. So make sure your security controls and monitoring are robust. Implement a secure web gateway, a firewall, intrusion detection. Make sure you have central logging with your SIEMs, your security information and event management solutions. Make sure you have a SOC or at least have a managed detection and response organization who can help you investigate any anomalous or suspicious network activity or endpoint activity that could be from a bad agent being pushed. Threat intel. Subscribe to indicators of compromise. Learn about your TTPs that are out there, your threat tactics and procedures that align with this process. Make sure your organization knows as part of their software build materials what vulnerabilities are out there as part of those build processes, that your binaries are properly managed in your Artifactory or your other binary restore points, that you're properly scanning those, updating those, and securing those. Yes, you may have to keep legacy vulnerable stuff in your Artifactory, but make sure you're updating it on the build process. Make sure that you're readily tearing it down if it's a cattle that has to stay up. So in this case, it's a server that needs to be up. Rephrase that again. Cattle is your ephemeral, so that's stuff that's going to spun up, do its job, and come back down. On the contrary, if it's your pet, the long-living server, or EC2, or anything else that needs to stay up for a long period of time, that you're patching it. Using that threat intel that you know that you need to harden your S3 buckets, your EC2s, to make sure that no one can get into your environment. Use these techniques that you learn from your threat intel as evidence, as knowledge. Share these with your teams. Put these in your quarterly decks that you have for your risk advisory board meetings. Put these in for your board meetings. Share these with your leaders. Take a story that you've learned from your threat intel and share it laterally and go north-south with it. Send it to your executives, also send it down a level. Knowledge is key here. Communication helps us be prepared to both monitor and be able to detect a software attack, a supply chain attack, or any other social engineering attack that can help within our environment. Which leads me into backup and recovery. I mentioned in the previous slide, you have to have regular maintained backups with a validated restore. Have you restored your data today? Ludas, you're saying, I can't restore. I have petabytes of data. Restore some of that critical data each and every time. Fail over to a secondary system and make sure that you can bring it back up online. Confirm those snapshots are viable in case you need to rebuild a critical database, application, web server, or application that you have the source code that you can redeploy. It's critical that you understand where your data is and if your data is backed up or copied or has the ability to be restored. Again, this goes back to your 3-2-1. Have 3 copies of your data, 2 different locations, with one of those being offline or not publicly accessible. So that's in an air gap network or in an isolated environment away from the adversary who could crawl your environment and destroy, harden, or in this case, potentially ransomware your data by stealing it and then extorting you by publishing it on the web. So best practices. In your vendor selection, carefully vet your vendors and supply chain providers based on their practices. What security do they do? If it's a small mom and pop or a small business, they may have less controls. So you'll need to put more compensating controls on your side to limit what they have access to. During your contractual reviews, make sure you have strong security clauses to make sure that there's attestation in the case of an event, that you have the ability to meet your organization's standards. Continuous monitoring. Regularly vet your vendors. Evaluate their security posture and make sure they're compliant and they have the agreed upon security measures. Training, training, training. Every day, all day long, we as the humans are the primary attack vector. We are the ones who interact with software as a service, so your applications in your browser. We're downloading things and interacting with them locally, and we're sharing data through many different mediums such as email, Slack, Teams, Signal, and other channels that we're giving information to our clients. Make sure we understand how to properly secure and protect ourselves from supply chain based events by protecting our sensitive information. Additionally, test your IR plans. Make sure you have one. Take time now to build one, to practice it, and run through a scenario. Do a tabletop and have a readout. Potentially have a third party come in and facilitate one so you can get lessons learned from a subjective person who's not involved. This may be harder for organizations who can't afford it, but find someone who can come in and just observe and give you lessons learned and feedback on how your process went. Pull a key stakeholder out. Make sure you understand if the CISO is not there, who has the authority to make the plan. If the CEO is on a plane and not able to approve. If your lead investigator happens to be on leave, what do you do? Play the different scenarios out, test them out to make sure that you have a plan of action to get the proper approvals if those leaders are out. If you're missing the subject matter expert, who's the next in line? This gives you the opportunity to lead into knowledge transfer and building knowledge articles and then being able to share those. Knowledge is key just as much as communication is vital. Ensure that you're sharing knowledge, you're testing your plans so that you can be able to withstand a supply chain attack. With that, I thank you for your time. I look forward to sharing more knowledge with you in the future in the coming year. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. If you enjoyed this video, take a moment to like and subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you again in the next video.